continue to worship our God this morning. Sing with us as we continue to praise Him. I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene, and wonder how He could love me, a sinner condemned unclean, singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. He took my sins and my sorrows. He made them His very own. He bore the burden to Calvary and suffered and died alone, singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. When with the ransom in glory, His face I at last shall see, 'twill be my joy through the ages to sing of His love for me, singing how marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. Lord, we thank you today for your love. God, we thank you that we can come together this morning and we can sing about how wonderful the salvation we can experience through Jesus Christ's sacrifice on the cross is. God, if there's any of us here today who have not experienced that salvation, God, may today be a day of salvation. Today be a day of repentance. God, as we all listen to you, as we open your word in just a few moments, God, allow it to penetrate our hearts and to change the very being of who we are. In your name, amen.
I invite you to open your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I'm going to continue this morning in the series we started last week on lessons learned, and is a personal series to me, just a personal story of what I've been through, and not just me, but my family over the last few weeks. And I hope and I think maybe you've seen that it's not about me. It really is about God, and God continues to do a work in us. And I hope that you understand that you should never get to the point where you feel like you've arrived spiritually, that there's nothing else that God can teach you, because there's always something more and greater and deeper. And when we discover these things, and that's what we shared, I shared last week, it's not that these things were new to me. I just got to experience them in a whole new way. And God working. And we talked last week about the power in prayer, and the power in prayer is God, and how important prayer was. And some of you will remember, and I can't remember now, I was going to look it up and I forgot. I think it was the first Sunday in August. It was either the first or the second Sunday in August when I stood before you and announced that Sarah had a brain tumor. And when I said that and told you that, I also told you that I had never felt so weak. Of course, you were very gracious to Carolyn and I and Sarah. You surrounded us immediately with your prayers and your love and the comfort that we found from that. I got to tell you, I didn't like feeling weak. To feel absolute powerless to do anything in that situation. I hope that what you've seen last week when I talked about it, we talked about the progression of my prayers. And I hope what you've seen through that was there was this shift and this transformation that was taking place in me. And it was from a position of weakness. And that's certainly how our prayer started out, this position of weakness, and to a position of strength. And if you've seen that, here's what you also need to know. The strength that you've seen wasn't from me. It was fully from God. And that's what we want to talk about this week when we talk about lessons learned. And it is the power of weakness. The power of weakness. And I got to tell you, that's a lesson that I struggle with. Because I never liked being perceived as weak. I don't think most people like being weak. And now, I don't mind if I see people, and I know the reality is there's this truth that I fully understand. Everybody's weak in some area. No matter who you are here today, you have weakness, whether we see it or don't see it. We just have areas of weakness in our life, that inability to do something or powerlessness to do certain things. And so we have that. And that doesn't bother me. And sometimes I deal with people all the time who are going through moments of weakness. And it doesn't bother me to deal with people. I don't judge people because they have something weak that's taking place in their life. Because I know and have always known that there's a strength that is available to them, and if God will use me somehow to show them that there's strength that can be found. But I never wanted to be perceived as weak. And that's something that I think is not uncommon for a lot of men. I worked very hard at keeping it out of my life. I think a lot of men do. But it was something that early on and through my experiences, and we talked at our men's breakfast yesterday about how God shapes us through our experiences in life and is preparing us for leadership and different things in life. And there's an experience that I had that was very, very much part of my mindset towards weakness. Because I was a kid, and was raised in church, and at church, in that setting where my parents were well known, and I was well known, and even though it was a larger church, I felt very, very comfortable in the church, and that was a bad thing, because as a kid who felt very, very, very comfortable in the church, I got in a lot of trouble. And I was constantly in trouble, and no one would believe that, take me outside of that setting and put me in a setting where I wasn't quite as comfortable, that I was very, very quiet. The people at church would not believe that about me at school. Oh no, at school, and that's it. And I wasn't real quiet at school. I had my friends, but growing up in a city that's larger than this, and I think I've shared this before. Then going into junior high, which for us was 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, and there was 3.5 elementary schools that fed into this one junior high that I went to. There was 4 junior highs in the city, and now I went from being this quiet kid that didn't really ever get in too much trouble, just the kind of trouble that normal boys would get into, but not a great deal of trouble, to going into a setting where I felt completely out of place. And they didn't really prepare us for something that we were going to experience in junior high. When you get together and you're the low man on the totem pole as a 7th grader, and you're put in there in this mix with 7th, 8th, and 9th graders, and everybody's trying to find their pecking order of where they belong, and in doing that, some people try to put other people in their place. We call them bullies. And I was bullied in the 7th grade. Played football, when football was at the beginning of the season, and after football we went into the off season, and if you were in football, you automatically went into the weightlifting class, and that's what we were going to do. And I discovered something. And I became very, very quiet because of the bullying and everything, and I just wanted to disappear into the wall. But I discovered something when we went into the weightlifting class. I was a lot stronger than most of the kids in the school. One of the first things we did, and they're going to set you up with a customized program, and if you've ever lifted weights, you understand that it's best to have, if you're going to do it seriously, you got to have a customized program and goals and all this kind of stuff. So they got to figure out where your max is. What's the most that you can do? And so that's the first thing we did that first week. We were maxing out on all the different areas. And I was, out of all the kids that were in athletics, I was the strongest 7th grader. But here's the thing, we had the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade were all in athletics together. There was only a handful of 8th graders that were stronger than me, and not a whole lot of 9th graders that were stronger than me when it came to lifting weights. See, I didn't know that before. And that gave me this whole new, I hated being bullied. Made me feel weak. And I went, and the one who was bullied became the bully. Now, I didn't pick on very seldom. I can't say never. And there are certainly people that if I knew how to get a hold of them, knew how to find them, I feel like I owe them a great apology. But I went and found all the bullies, all the ones who made me feel weak. And I let them know I was not weak. I said, well, that's you were just a kid back then. Oh yeah, I've carried that mindset with me my whole life. Into a young adult, and that's the reason I had so many problems. And if you've heard my story, I said I was mean. As a teenager and a young adult, I was just mean because I didn't want to be perceived as weak. But you also know, if you know my story, that a transformation took place and God got a hold of my heart. And a change really took place within me. But I still didn't like being perceived as weak. And I think most of us don't like being perceived as weak. But as God has grown me in my life, I became less concerned about people seeing me as weak. And really that helped me because I didn't feel like I had to try and prove myself. And that's very freeing if you don't feel like you have to prove yourself. Because if you feel like you're weak and you don't want to be perceived as weak, then you feel like you have to prove yourself. And you're constantly in this battle of trying to prove yourself. And weakness comes in a variety of ways. There's physical weakness, there's mental weakness, there's emotional weakness, spiritual weakness. But God has grown me through the years. So when it came to physical weakness, I didn't want to be physically weak, so I don't lift weights anymore, but I do exercise, and I'm aware of my physical well-being. I know what I'm supposed to be eating, and sometimes I eat what I'm supposed to be eating. Sometimes I just eat what I want. And what changed in me, and this is where God grew me in this area, because before I used to exercise, why? So I could be strong, and I didn't want to be weak. And I've shared this. Some of you remember this. The reality is like, wait a minute. Because I'm not physically healthy, I'm placing limits on what God can do through me. And so I became more physically healthy because I don't know what God's plans are for me, but whatever they might be, I want to be physically able to do the things that God desires of me to do. And so that changed in me. I never wanted to be perceived as mentally weak, and so studying and research, even though I blew off education in high school, the reality is I did study. I was what would be considered smart somewhat. I would read, I would study, and I love to study. It's interesting because, I didn't go to college until 10 years after high school, and I blew off high school and had no idea. And now it's like, oh man, I'm going to go. And I remember taking ACTs and SATs, and I go to take it, and here's all these high school kids. Here I am, 28 years old, taking it, and I'm thinking, what in the world am I doing here? And some of them were finishing like really quick, and I'm like, oh no. It was, but I prepared very, very hard for those tests and did well. And I discovered I actually like the research. I like studying things. And if I don't know something, I enjoy doing the research in that. I'm okay with not knowing everything. And there's things that I don't understand. I'd like to help you with your calculus, but I can't. I could. You will fail calculus if I help you. Then there's that emotional weakness, and that was very real. And I got to tell you, I made a mistake that I think a lot of men like me make, and some of you may be making it too. Oh, real men don't show emotions. And the reality is, real men are afraid of emotions. If that's the mindset, the reality is. So I can't show them because I'm afraid of them. And I've learned that I don't have to be afraid of my emotions. God created me with emotions, and He created you with emotions. Jesus Christ wept, and because He was full with compassion, His emotions were overwhelmed. And when we study His life, we see several times where He expressed emotion. There's nothing wrong with expressing emotion, but yet God has grown me to know that, okay, it's okay to express my emotions, but be careful. Your emotions can be deceiving. They will mislead you. They lie to you. But if you understand that, you know what they do? They draw you to God. And that's a wonderful place to be. And so emotionally, I've considered myself to be healthier emotionally and not as weak emotionally because I don't hide from them. Spiritually, I do the things necessary so that I am spiritually strong. Spiritual disciplines, I enjoy the study and preparation for sermons and different things. I enjoy studying stuff that maybe other people don't enjoy studying as much. But the reality is it's not the study that grows you spiritually. It's that willingness to open up your heart to God and to seek Him in the study. Being in church in and of itself, that's a good thing. But it doesn't necessarily grow you spiritually. It doesn't make you spiritually strong. You can be spiritually weak. I was for years. Went to church. I grew up in church. How many had the experience? Because we went, growing up in our house, I went Sunday morning, to Sunday school and to church. We came Sunday night. We had to go early because that's when they did choir practice. And then we'd often stay late. And then we had Wednesday night Bible study. And then we had Thursday night visitation and Saturday morning visitation. And as a kid, I was taken along to all that stuff. And that's the reason I was so comfortable at church, because that's where I spent most of my time. It was at church. But during that time, even though I was at church, I was not growing spiritually. Well, now I understand just being here is not going to grow me, and being here is not going to grow you. I can do the spiritual disciplines, and I spend time alone with the Lord, not just studying for the sake of studying, not just studying for the sake of a sermon, but honestly seeking God. Because I know that if I don't honestly seek God, I'll be spiritually weak. And that part of me, never wanting to be weak, has never left. So when I got up here and I said, I have never felt so weak. That was a big deal for me. Not to admit it, but at that place in my life and where I was at, I was scared. Because I knew that what we were facing, I was going to be very, very limited. And the reality is I've had multiple surgeries on my knee and on my shoulder and stuff like that. And here's the thing about those kind of surgeries. I don't mind those kind of surgeries because, you know what? A lot of the success to that, you got to have a good doctor. You got to have a surgeon who knows what they're doing. But the reality is then it depends on you doing the work. And so, okay, I can handle that. You tell me what I got to do, doc, and I'll do that. Oh, no, this was completely different than that. They weren't giving Sarah this list of stuff that you have to do in order to be able to conquer this. They said, listen, we're going to do the best we can, but here's what you need to expect. I have to tell you, God has grown me through the years, and I am my attitude towards weakness has changed, and God has grown me. I understand, as Paul did in Philippians chapter 3, he said, but whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For His sake I've suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ and be found in Him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith. And God had grown me to a place in my life, and it's God's doing. Understand this, that what He is doing is available. He did it in me, and He'll do it in you because He's got the power to do it. It was this idea. He talks about, Paul says, I've suffered loss. You know what that is? Weakness. I've suffered these moments of weakness in my life where things were taken out of my control, but it's okay because I have learned something through that, and my faith is stronger. We've been through stuff in life. We've been through things, and even this year, for me personally, the setback when I had the knee replacement in December, That was frustrating. I still get a little mad about that once in a while. I'm pretty sure the only reason I haven't beat Don on the golf course is because of those setbacks with my knee. That's it. But I can honestly say that anything that we've suffered in life, I know that God has been faithful and our faith has grown through that, and there's this confidence that I just live my life with. And it's not me, it's Christ in me. And yet when I get to a place like that, it's like, wait a minute. Why am I feeling so weak? And then when we get the call on Father's Day or the night before Father's Day that Dad may not make it through the night, and then that they're putting him in hospice. And you know, if you were here, I was emotional that day. That's okay to be emotional. I know I had this great confidence in God. I knew what He was doing in me, and I've seen Him work. And I want to be found in Him. It's not that it's always been easy. The reality is, all of us, we face challenges, whether physically, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually, that cause us to feel weak. But I believe by the grace of God that I can say, as Paul would later say in Philippians chapter 4, I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. Because I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound, and in any and every circumstance I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And I know that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I've seen God's hand on me, and I know that He has a plan and a purpose, and that I can trust Him in all things. And sometimes, and I hope that this isn't the case, but sometimes I fear it comes across as arrogant. I'm not arrogant. Anything that has happened is because of God. That's what I know, and I believe. But then, we faced a situation that I was not prepared for. But yet, God had prepared me for it. I think the world of Sarah. She's special to us. She's the one we shared. We weren't supposed to have her. 11 years after Bryce. She's the answer to prayer. She was our miracle child. So as I shared last week, it's like, God, you can't take her away. Don't let my baby hurt. God, you got to help me because I can't. I felt like I needed to be strong for Carolyn and for Sarah. I was like, how can I? I can't even be strong for myself. And people sought to encourage me. And I've shared this. One of the statements that just resounded with me, and the statement that I've made so many times, His grace is sufficient. His grace is sufficient. God will see you through. God's got this. Those were the statements that I heard that always connected with me at a deep level. Those were the statements that were reminders of everything that God had already brought us through. And I knew God had a plan and a purpose for us. And even in this, even in my sorrow and even in my weakness, that was not going to change. And His grace was going to be sufficient. But I still felt very weak. And you know what I discovered? It's good to be weak. It is good to be weak. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, let me just share, because Paul's talking about an episode in his life. And I want to look at this, in this weakness and what God is doing and why that weakness became power in me. God's power working in me. And here's what it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. And Paul's talking here, and here's basically what he's saying. Weakness keeps you humble before God. Weakness keeps you humble before God. And here's what Paul said. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. And 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. Paul had this situation in his life, this thorn in the flesh. We don't know what it is, and I think that was intentional by God. And a lot of theologians have looked at it and have studied it and tried to come up with what they believe that it was. And there's all kinds of theories, and most of them, they look from other areas of Scripture. But here's the truth. Paul doesn't tell us what it is. So we don't know if it was his eyes, if it was some other kind of physical ailment. These are some of the popular guesses. One of them is he had sin in his life that he couldn't deal with, and they look to Romans chapter 7 because of that, and use that. But the truth is, all you look at, there's nothing that connects what Paul is saying here in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 with all these other things that we can discern about Paul. What we know is that there was something going on in his life that was a constant struggle, is an area of weakness. What I find interesting when I read this, he says 3 times, I came to you, Lord, and I prayed 3 times asking you to remove this thorn, and you didn't. You know what I find interesting about that? Is that, why'd you stop at 3? Because there's several things that I've prayed for a whole lot more than 3 times. I've asked God in the same prayer more than 3 times for something. You know? There's been times where I've gone to God and I'm like a kid who wants something from their parent at the store. You know those kids. You've seen them. At one point, it was your kids probably. Oh, I want this. No, you can't have it. Please, please, please. No, I said, no, you can't have it. I'll clean my room. I'll do whatever. Just let me get this one thing. I really, really need it. No, you can't. No, give me this. I'll never ask for anything else ever again in my entire life. Have you ever done that? Yeah, see, and kids do, and the reality is, okay, I've not prayed like that, but I got to tell you, I've prayed hard, I've prayed continuously, I've prayed and I've asked God, and I find it interesting. I think there's this reminder here that Paul was probably a whole lot stronger in his faith than I was, because after 3 times and God didn't answer, maybe he realized, okay, God's got another plan. But the reason that he had this thorn in the flesh, and he come to realize after 3 times, is it was keeping him reliant upon God. Keeping him reliant upon God. We know that we're supposed to trust God with everything, but the reality is sometimes, even as a follower of Christ, we can be guilty of trusting ourselves more than God. So we do things that we think we have learned ourselves. We rely upon our own strength instead of looking with this idea that, you know what, God may be doing something different here. And we would never say this as a follower of Christ, but the reality is, I don't need to ask God. I've got this. I don't need to seek God in this area of my life because I'm strong enough. I'm wise enough. I'm not weak in this area. There's nothing that you or I will ever face in this life that we shouldn't seek God. And to know Him, to know His will, and to know His leading and His directing and the peace that He gives us in all situations. And sometimes we just need to experience weakness in order to trust Him at that level. So weakness keeps us humble before God. But also weakness is necessary in order for us to know the sufficient grace of God. In verse 9, Paul, after realizing and praying for God to take this thorn from him, he said, Jesus, here's what Jesus taught me. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. This is what he said. This is what God said. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. Paul said, therefore I will boast the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. You know what he's saying? That's how I get your grace. That's how I know what you are doing in my life and can see you at work in my life and to know that you have a greater purpose than I would ever come up with on my own in my life. That's what I have to do is just be weak. All in on that. And just so we know, Paul was not a weak man. Some people want to say that he was probably one of the things that some will say he was physically, he was short, he wasn't probably a very strong person. Well, he was a tent maker, and back in that day, that was hard physical labor, and we see his stories and all that he endured. Oh no, Paul was not a weak man. But he's saying, you know what? Yes, Lord, in order for me to see your power, in order for me to have the power of Christ resting on me, then make me weak. Make me weak. Because God's grace is sufficient. The problem is we don't always believe that. The problem is we live our life as though something else is necessary for sufficiency. We can be guilty of believing that, oh no, God's grace is sufficient, but I also need this just to help me in my life. I need this other area. What is that? Well, money sure does help, doesn't it? Can we be guilty of thinking, Lord, if I just had more money, my life would be better. My life would be all that you meant for it to be. What we're saying is, God, you're sufficient for some things, but my life can't be fully complete without money. So money is what really is sufficient. Health. We can look at health and say, man, health is necessary. necessary for sufficiency. Lord, you got to give me health. Or, if you'll give me health, then I can be who you want me to be. No, the reality is, you can be who God wants you to be, even with physical infirmities. You can be that person. Do you need health? No, you want health, just like you want money. I enjoy it when I'm healthy. Sometimes it's a job. Lord, I really, really, really need this job. Have you ever prayed like that? Lord, I really, really need this job. Because somehow in our mind, we feel like that job is going to provide for us what is missing. And then the hard one, family. I need my family. In order for my life to be complete, I need my family. This is tricky, because the reality is, family was designed by God, and it is a great blessing to us. This world has messed it up badly. Your family should be a great blessing to you. But your family isn't sufficient to carry you through all the things that you will go through. Your spouse, some of you have been married a long time, and you have this wonderful relationship. You say, I don't know how I could live without my spouse. It's good to feel that kind of love, but the reality is your spouse can't sustain you. They're not sufficient to give you what you truly need in life, and the power that you need in life. You know, I was guilty early. And I told you last week how I was struggling, telling God I didn't want to be angry. I don't want to be angry, God. I don't want to be angry. I was kind of angry. I didn't want to know if there was this possibility of the worst happening. I didn't want to know that. Lord, I don't know what I'm going to do if anything happens to my baby girl. I don't know what I'm going to do. I was weak. But you know what? None of that, none of the stuff that we look to is sufficient to help us to understand the power of Christ resting upon us to carry us and know how to live in this falling world. Only God's grace is sufficient. These other things, whether it's money, whether it's health, whether it's a job, whether it's family, they are great blessings from God, but they are temporary. All of it is temporary. There's only one permanent thing, eternal thing that you can have and that I can have. And it's that relationship with God. I needed it to be able to supply. I needed God's grace to help me through a very difficult time. But in order to fully experience the grace of God that's sufficient, you have to let go of whatever it is you're holding on to in your life as your source of strength. I was holding on to Sarah. God gave her to us as a blessing. He couldn't take her away. Say, well, Pastor, he didn't. That's another message. I'm telling you, there was a part of me that did not know what was going to happen. And I had to let go. I had to let go of thinking that I would not be able to go on if anything bad happened to my daughter. Man, the stuff that we hold on to that we think somehow completes our life, it's hard to let go of that stuff. Letting go makes you feel weak. I couldn't let go of Sarah. She was my blessing from God. Still is. But when I let go, I said, okay, God, I'm going to trust you. You know what I discovered? His grace was sufficient. And that happened, and this is important for you to understand. All that happened before the surgery. That change and that transformation in me, where I went from this position of complete weakness to a position where there was a strength resting on me that I couldn't fully explain, that happened before we had any answers. His grace isn't sufficient to give you what you want. His grace is sufficient to carry you through this life no matter what happens. No matter what happens. And then lastly, what we need to see in this power of weakness is the strength of weakness is God's grace. Weakness is necessary, but that's where the strength is. Verse 10, Paul said, "For the sake of Christ, then I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." I need to tell you, God did a work in our lives. People would say, I don't know how you're doing it. I don't know how you're doing it. God. How can you stay so upbeat and so positive? God. You know, the one thing I didn't like hearing, there were people that say, you know what? I just know. I just know that God's going to heal her. How do you know? That's what I wanted to say, because because I don't like to be perceived as weak, so I like to get up in people's faces sometimes, but God keeps me from doing that. How do you know? Has God given you some kind of special revelation that He's not given to me? I know that's what you want. And I want it too. I deeply, deeply want it. But here's what I believed. I believe the doctors were giving us their very best information. And I knew they were fully convinced. I believed that they were fully convinced of what they thought the best case scenario was. But I was fully convinced that God could take the strength and ability that He had given them and use it beyond anything that they had ever experienced before. Would He? I didn't know. But I believe that He could. We've seen the strength and the power of God resting on us. So Wednesday, we're at the follow-up appointment with the neurosurgeon. And before meeting with him, one of the fellow doctors comes in, and we'd not met with her before. But she's a full-fledged doctor, and she's been doing this for some time under the care of Dr. Cohen. I don't think she read the chart before she came in. She knew a little bit. But when she came in, immediately she seemed a little confused. And after talking and asking some questions, here's what she said. This is truly miraculous. To be where you are at today with a tumor that size, it's miraculous. Yes, it is. And there was a lot of prayer. A lot of prayer. Her response to that gave me this sinking feeling that she herself doesn't personally know the power of God. I think Dr. Cohen does through our conversations. She immediately got a little nervous about that and wanted to move on. No, we're not here to talk about spiritual things. Well, let me tell you, I can't. If we're going to talk about my daughter, if we're going to talk about what happened, we got to talk about spiritual stuff. The grace, and this is important, the grace isn't because of the miracle that took place in the surgery and in the recovery. The grace has been what's sustaining us all throughout this. And is what we want to continue to have, this power of Christ resting upon us, because we still don't know everything. And here's the reality. You don't know everything either in your life. We make our plans, and it's good to have plans. I'm a planner, and I'm a goal setter, and I think that's good. I think you ought to be too. But the reality is, you don't know. How many, if you were setting, at the beginning of the year, and I do this at the beginning of the year, I don't make New Year's resolutions, I make plans and I set goals. And there's a difference, because if they're resolutions, you can forget about them the next day. But a goal is something that stays out in front of you, that you pursue. And you look at and you adjust your life to the various things that are taking place so you can keep your eyes on that goal. And most of my goals every year, and I do this at the beginning of every year, they're spiritual goals. It's what God is doing in me and what He wants to do through me, and wanting to be the man that God wants me to be. But if you set goals this year, how many of you planned on your goal including a pandemic? And I say that because you don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. But that doesn't have to scare you. And that lack of knowledge and that lack of complete certainty, that shouldn't frighten us. That should cause us to humble ourselves before God so that He can have His perfect work in us. It should cause us to want to be weak so we can know the power of Christ resting on us. And so that we can experience firsthand His amazing grace. Because I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I know whether it's good or whether it's bad, the most important thing for me tomorrow is to know God's grace upon me and to recognize His presence within me. But that's not just for me. That's for you as well. What have I learned? Weakness? Not near as bad as I thought it was. The reality is, it has been very, very good for me to be weak. Because I experienced the grace of God. And that grace is available to you as well. I'm going to ask you to stand. We're going to bring our services to a close.